Everyone has their favorite character. For different reasons, of course. Some may like their perks, how they look, or more rarely, for Dead by Daylight at least, people like them for their lore. Now, Dead by Daylight lore isn't perfect by any means. However, there are some characters that just don't get love. And one of those characters happens to be one of my favorites on the Survivor's End. A character with surprisingly touching and rich lore, thematic and fitting perks, and an above-average visual design. Today, we will be talking about Felix Richter, Dead by Daylight's visionary architect. Felix Richter, at first glance, is not obvious to read by his visual design. The man is the very image of business and professionalism. Next to Ace, this guy has got to be one of the most dripped-out male survivors in the realms if we're going by default cosmetics. The man's got slicked back hair, light stubble, a fair figure, and a confident stance. I still remember when he was released, and everyone was foaming at the mouth over Felix versus David. Except it's very clear that David won because I see our favorite British debt collector everywhere, and I see Felix at least once every 20 games. However, David is very clear about what he is through his stance and menu icon. A bar brawler with no qualms with getting into fights. However, just by looking at Felix, you get that he's attractive and professional, and that's about it. This is just part of the beauty of Felix and his story. This is because Felix, deep down, is not confident. Quite the opposite, actually. It's very rare nowadays that we get survivors that aren't exactly beacons of positive self-esteem or confidence, but I'd argue that Felix is more of a nervous wreck than Dwight Fairfield. The story begins following Felix at a young age, and goes over how his parents are very wealthy due to their efforts in the medical field. His parents often took Felix around on trips to different places around the world, and let him experience all kinds of different cultures. At a young age, Felix would find an overwhelming love for architecture, and decided to make it his life's goal to become an inspirational architect. Unfortunately, Felix was always very insecure and antisocial throughout his life, and this only got worse over time, even with his talents. He would win awards once he got into architecture fully, around his 20s, but his insecurities began catching up to him, believing himself to be a hack, and that all his success was a result of his rich lifestyle. Felix also had a great relationship with his parents, especially his father, who tried to break him out of his shell, and despite initially failing, he would continue to support his son's dreams. Eventually, they'd make a trip down to Dire Island, and for those unfamiliar, that place is very important, as it has ties to both El Diracoto and Talbot Grimes, the Blight. During his teenage years, Felix would find a group of people his age, children of wealthy people visiting the island for one reason or another, and he'd be roped into the group known as the Pariahs. 5 people, including Felix and Elodie, who went around the island exploring ancient ruins, not quite fitting the high society mold of the other kids. However, one expedition went horribly wrong, and ended with the entity taking the parents of all the Pariahs. Safe to say, this hit Felix especially hard. Despite years of the Pariahs' efforts, they could never find their parents, and eventually just disbanded and tried to move on with their lives. Let's take this in a bit. This impostor syndrome is one of Felix's key traits, especially during the beginning of his story. He's a passionate person who chalks up all of his achievements to dumb luck because he doesn't think he's talented, which, as far as the story goes, is completely untrue. Felix's anxieties and low self-esteem culminate likely from knowing that he's far better off than most people financially, resulting in him feeling he doesn't deserve any of the achievements he's earned. The only thing supporting him and trying to ensure he was worthy of praise was his father, and the entity ripped him away. Continuing on, Felix eventually realized that his father was right about his lack of social skills holding him back. In an attempt to move on and push forwards with his life, he decided to play a confident facade. If he couldn't get confident, he was going to act confident. This resulted in him getting a girlfriend and an architecture firm with her, as well as several other deals with other architecture firms. But despite somewhat solving the issue with socializing, he still couldn't quite shake the feeling that he was a fraud, and eventually he had a full-on spiral. He wanted his father. He wanted advice. He wanted to feel secure. He tried to fill the empty void with alcohol and partying, but before he could descend any further, his girlfriend revealed her pregnancy. With this reveal, Felix worked to turn his life around for his son. He wanted to be an inspiration for him, as his own father was to himself. Eventually, he faced his demons and returned to Dire Island to pursue a restoration project. And upon following an apparition of his father into some mist, he was never seen again. So, yeah, Felix's story follows a poor German boy suffering from low self-esteem only to get his life back on track after, losing his family to the entity in front of his eyes! What's so awesome about Felix's story is that, unlike Elodie, who basically clings to her family for her entire life, Felix manages to try and move on from this tragedy and grows as a person from it. But not only that, they manage to write it in a realistic way that portrays him as a person with feelings. He feels grief and depression, and proceeds to grow from his bad experiences despite his confidence issues, with the information of him becoming a father motivating him to be like his own father, an inspiring man who supported him even at his lowest. Felix is a fucking Chad. One of the most interesting aspects is the symbolic connection between him and the Blight, the killer he was released with. The title of the chapter, Descend Beyond, fits both of these characters quite well. Talbot falls further and further into depravity and addiction, the more he learns about the realms, eventually morphing into a mindless shell of what he once was. While Felix, on the other hand, experienced a descent into depression, but he managed to climb his way back up. He ascended, whereas Blight descended. Felix Richter is a criminally underappreciated character, who I feel accurately displays impostor syndrome and how it can affect someone, no matter how successful they may be. He began an intriguing storyline involving him, Elodie, and 3 outcasts who went their separate ways trying to find their parents, and he came alongside a thematically fitting and powerful killer. I really hope you give Felix a shot at some point, because this survivor has always held a very special place in my heart. Overall, this was our video essay on Felix Richter. Tell us what you think about Felix in the comments. Like, subscribe, turn on notifications if you like hearing our voices, and we hope to see you again. Bye-bye.